We often believe that we need to change who we are to be loved and accepted. Yet in the process of shape-shifting to meet others' needs and expectations, we often lose the very core, the true heart of who we are. The cost to the self can be devastating. I have come to believe that those who truly understand what it is to love and be loved don't ask us to compromise our imperfectly wonderful selves and the values that make us who we are. How can we learn to stand strong in ourselves despite the external pressure to conform? Today, we'll focus on this listener's real life question. My partner has a Peter Pan type personality. I was drawn in by his carefree ways at the start of our relationship, but he's become more and more selfish and is always going off on his own adventures. By default, I bear the load of the financial and daily responsibilities and am losing a sense of who I am. I don't want to change him, but can you help me to get him to grow up? And with that question as the focus of today's episode, I'm Dr. Carla Manly, and this is Imperfect Love.
Welcome to Imperfect Love with Dr. Carla Manly, psychologist, author, and relationship expert. I'm here to help unravel mysteries and misconceptions about love, relationships, and mental health issues, plus everything in between. Love is complicated, people are not perfect, and relationships surely can be tough. Together, we'll navigate this messy, imperfect space of real life.
Today, I'm joined by a very special guest, Dr. Literski, who will be sharing their experience on psychology, spirituality, and the puer, or Peter Pan, syndrome. Welcome to the podcast, Dr. Nick. It's such a joy to have you with us today.
Thank you. I'm very happy to be here.
So I know that there's a lot that makes you you. I have had a few reads of your bio, and it is quite impressive. So before we launch into today's podcast, can you tell our listeners a little bit about what makes you you?
Okay. Well, many people who know me say that I've lived numerous lives in this life. So I have a pretty varied background, quite frankly. I came out of college, went into the juvenile justice system, uh, and through that process became more interested in the law. So I went to law school. I practiced law for several years, but ultimately found that it wasn't really who I was at my heart. It wasn't satisfying in that sense. And so I began a period of transformation. And ultimately, I ended up taking a master's program in spiritual guidance at Sophia University, which was really wonderful. I had some amazing instructors. And that allowed me to begin working with clients in their own search for spirituality. And spirituality is something that's been very core to me since early childhood memories. It's always been a strong interest of mine. Through the process of that training, I was introduced to the work of Carl Jung, and that really sparked me. It made me go on further to obtain another master's degree and a PhD in uh, depth psychology with an emphasis in Jungian and archetypal studies. And with that, I've been able to work with my clients in spiritual guidance in a much deeper way, working with their dreams, working with various archetypes, helping them to see what they're going through as part of the larger stories and mythologies of the world, and to normalize their experience and give it context and beauty. I am currently teaching at the California Institute of Integral Studies in their undergraduate psychology program. But beginning in September, I will begin a position as core faculty at Pacifica Graduate Institute in the Depth Psychology and Creativity program. So that's my next exciting thing on the horizon.
Oh my goodness, you are one of those that just don't stop growing and evolving. It is, oh, and you and I, we have so many things in common, but we can have another conversation about that. So two things. I mean, you said so many things that I find fascinating, but for our listeners, many people combine spirituality and religion as if they are the same thing.
Mhm.
And so please explain the difference for our listeners. And the other thing that you talked about, which is near and dear to me, are archetypes, because I too am a Jungian oriented therapist. So people might not know what an archetype is. So let's start with spirituality and religion and then move to archetypes, please.
Okay. Well, we'll tackle the hard question first, because the fact is, if you ask 20 scholars of religion and spirituality to define those terms, you'll get 25 responses. No different field really has a cohesive definition of religion or spirituality. But in brass tacks, in our lived experiences, I really look at religion as organized spirituality. Spirituality is an inborn sense. Jung talked about the religious instinct, our desire to reach out and connect with something that's larger than ourselves, more powerful than ourselves, and beyond our understanding. That to me is spirituality. Now, throughout history, we've had different groups and different cultures find ways to make that connection. And the traditions that they've created, the systems they've created, that is what I look at more as religion. So, that's the best definition I can give you there.
I think it's absolutely wonderful, which is going to take me to another question. When you look at spirituality and religion, do you think that there is a God?
Well, for myself, and understand, I've had a long spiritual journey myself.
Hmm.
I was raised as a young child in sort of a non-denominational Christian context. I became Mormon at the age of 13, which is a very high demand, very structured, very authoritarian, hierarchical religious tradition.
Oh, yes, it is.
I spent 26 years, and that part of my life was so important and contributed so much to who I am. Uh, it's in many ways it saved my life as a teenager. As an older person coming into middle age, it no longer worked for me. Partly as a matter of my coming out, so that was not compatible with that tradition. But really, it was time to grow and move on. I went through a period of time for about 4 years where I sort of purged. And then I ended up in 3 years of training in shamanic practices with a teacher. And then I've gone on from there, really gone back to an interest that's been with me for many years, which is the Western esoteric tradition and ceremonial magic. So for me, getting back to your question, I'll make sure I didn't get too much of a tangent there in background. But our spirituality is a journey. It's something that we need to be able to be open with and ready to grow and adapt
Hmm.
and respond to.
Hmm.
The danger comes when we decide that we have the final answer and we dig our heels in, and that stops growth. Uh, it also takes the authority away from us internally, and that's something I work so much with my clients about is learning to take spiritual authority inside instead of placing it outside in a text or a person or or some outside source.
I love how you said, so much of what you say I concur with. And I really appreciate the piece where you talk about when we think we have the final answer. I'm paraphrasing you, but when we
Mhm.
think we have the final answer, we stop growing.
Yes.
And I think whether we're looking at it as the God, a God, the divine, a spiritual journey, that when we open ourselves up to evolution, to the awe that is within the universe. And constantly, it's the premise of my book, The Joy of Imperfect Love, my last
Mhm.
book, where when we keep working, keep journeying, continue that evolution of spirituality, which is necessarily intertwined with the journey of the self, because we are spiritual beings. no matter what our religious affiliation, if we even have one, and I'm making
Mhm.
that the organized piece that you were talking about.
Sure.
So I'm really in accord with you, and thank you for highlighting the piece about when we think we have the answers, when we think we know it all, whatever it is, in whatever area, we stop growing because
Right.
that belief that I am right, I know everything, it's a jail cell.
It really is. I mean,
It is. It's a
in my
prison.
yeah, in my personal practice, in my personal spirituality, I like to refer to the divine
Mhm,
rather than saying God.
mhm.
And there's nothing wrong with God, but to me, the divine or the numinous is just that. It's beyond our understanding. Our attempts to describe the divine or to give an image to it are always going to be imperfect. And you're actually joining me in my temple room. But if you were to see all the way around me, there are many figurines and images of different gods and other spiritual beings. And I work with, this vast pantheon from many traditions and very eclectic. But it's because to me, we can choose which masks of the divine to work with and to help us center on where our growth is needed at a given time.
And we could talk for hours about this, and again, as a Jungian depth psychologist, I so appreciate because when we look at the universal desire for religion, for spirituality, that there is no right or wrong to it. And as I like to say, my religion is kindness, right? That's my
Mhm.
spirit. And I love how you talk about the numinous, because I think that that's one element that is common in
Right.
all religious and spiritual traditions.
Mhm.
The numinous, that sense of something bigger,
Right.
something intangible beyond who we are. So,
Yeah.
okay, before I get us lost in that conversation so we can get to the listener's question and
Sure.
the Peter Pan, the puer
Mhm.
syndrome, can you talk a little bit so we have a foundational sense of archetypes? And
Absolutely.
archetypes are a core piece of Jungian psychology. And listeners, when you hear the word Jungian, we're talking about psychotherapists who believe in Carl Jung's work. So we call ourselves Jungian. All
Right.
right. So the floor goes to you, Dr. Nick.
Okay. You remind me of Carl Jung when he said, "Thank God I'm young and not a Jungian." But but in any case, one of the ways I like to explain this to people, there are studies of some of our small animal friends where from infancy, from birth, they will recognize a silhouette of a bird of prey, and they will immediately go into panic mode when they see that silhouette, even if they were born in captivity and have never come across a bird of prey. So there's something inborn, there's something in their nature, whether that's partly DNA, whether that's memory through generations, whatever the source of that is. There are certain things and certain shapes, if you will, that are pre-programmed in us. Carl Jung, when he talked about archetypes, gave the image of channels of water. And those channels may run dry at times, but when the water comes, it's going to fall into those channels. So, in our makeup as humans, those channels have different names. Things like mother, things like father, things like magician, things like sage, things like crone. These are archetypes, and they're general forms. They're big picture. Now, how you and I experience mother may be very, very different. And our individual experience of that archetype is what Carl Jung called a complex. But when we get into spirituality, it's really useful to work on an archetypal level and think of those big pictures. When we talk about mother, the very earliest manifestations of human spirituality, if we go back 32,000 years to the images in Chauvet Cave, what we see is the mother goddess. Yeah, the giver and gateway of life. That is actually our earliest religious manifestation in art and practice. And so that is an archetype that has followed us down for thousands and thousands of years. And therefore, it becomes useful. Therefore, it becomes something that we can track in dreams, in myth, in story, and in our personal experience as well, and bring us into context of what it means to be human.
Thank you for that very eloquent explanation. And as a firm believer in the power of archetypes, I'd like to add that we see them in, for people who are familiar with tarot cards or
Mhm, mhm.
oracle cards, or people who like Shakespeare, or as you were saying, Greek mythology.
Right.
We can see these characters, the king, the
Mhm,
orphan, the fool, whatever it is, that are universal. Every culture around the world may have a different name for it,
right.
but we all know what it means when someone says father
Mhm,
or orphan or king. We all know what it means to be the fool, to be the hanged man, so to speak,
mhm,
any of
mhm.
those. And so I love the power, and I also appreciate how you brought dreams into it, because our dreams are so wonderful. They are sometimes, just detritus dreams, just throwaway dreams, but often they have so much power and
Mhm.
meaning
Yeah.
because our dreams speak to us in code. They're,
Yes.
they have messages for us. So tell us, please, a little bit. I know you're conversant on so many topics, but let's talk about the listener's question. This
Mhm.
individual, I don't know the gender, and the gender doesn't matter, but
Right.
they are very frustrated with their partner. And we often, you know this as a healer yourself,
Mhm,
often the elements that we're drawn to in a partner. We're like, oh, I love this wildness. I love this quietness. I love this adventurous spirit. I love this person's, tendency to dot every I and cross every T. So we fall in love with something.
mhm.
And then as we get to know the person, that which we loved, we become a little a little jaded. We
Right.
become, and especially if it continues to grow and grow, it's no longer attractive. And it sounds as if the listener who wrote in, that they are very disenchanted with what they are terming their significant other's Peter Pan qualities.
Right.
And you and I know this as the puer complex or syndrome.
Mhm,
Could you
mhm.
explain that, please?
Sure. So the archetype of the puer is the youth. It's puer or puella, as far as masculine or feminine. But the puer is young and excited and energetic. The puer is constantly striving. In terms of spirituality, it's always ascendant. It's always going for the stars, without restraint, without the careful consideration.
Mm,
Uh, and the thing about the puer is, we live in a culture that says you must grow up, you must be responsible, you must take charge. It's not The puer is not a bad thing in and of itself. It is a necessary thing. At the same time, we have the senex, which is, which should always really be walking side by side with the puer. One of the wonderful myths that I love is Zeus and Ganymede. And of course, we all, if you know the stories of Zeus, Zeus was not the most monogamous of the
no,
gods
he
by
was
any
not.
means. He was not. But his wife was a great example of the senex. Hera was responsible. She was a mother figure that always had things in hand, always was doing the responsible thing. A little bit like what this listener is describing. And that's important. That's vital. But Zeus, as you said, that was Zeus's partner. And so what happens? He sees the young Ganymede, and that is something that apparently he is missing, and he's drawn to that. And so, as the story goes, he essentially kidnaps Ganymede, um, but they enter into relationship. And this goes on until he finally makes Ganymede his cupbearer. Ganymede, and eventually, of course, is placed among the stars. But as we look through art, particularly on that relationship, we continually see this idea that the two need each other. We see images in sculpture of Ganymede offering water or food to Zeus in eagle form. We see even sometimes images of Ganymede dominating Zeus, which is, sort of contrary to what we might expect, but it shows up in art.
Hmm.
This is a continual exchange. The senex needs to be invigorated by the puer, and the puer needs to be restrained and channeled by the senex. So I really love that this listener is saying, hey, I don't want to change my partner, because your partner is going to be who your partner is. You know, all of us, I think any of us who've been in a relationship for any length of time see aspects of our partner that, as you said, may have even attracted us in the first place. And now we wish we could adjust to our image of how they ought to be. But one of the important things here is to realize that the goal is not to eliminate the puer. The goal is in, to feed and encourage and uh, nourish the puer with this senex aspect.
And
So the
oh, I'm sorry. Continue, please.
okay, so when we sit back and we see something that we see that's problematic, we sort of want to take it and replace it with the opposite. And when it comes to the senex and puer, it's not something that can be replaced with the opposite. It's something where we need to merge the two, because both of these archetypes actually are in deep need of each other.
I was going to say it sounds very much like you're talking about creating balance, not extracting the puer from this partner, but helping the puer find balance
Mhm.
so that the other partner is not feeling like they have to be responsible for everything. And then when we
Right.
infuse that sense of balance and help draw some of the response draw the puer to take some responsibility, to
Mhm.
become a little more down to earth, as
Mhm.
the Peter Pans have difficulty doing, then it lightens the load for the individual who's been bearing the responsibility, which allows them to feel some lightness of being as well.
Right. And honestly, it gives the puer a needed rest. It seems paradoxical. We say take more responsibility, but actually, as I said, the puer has this continual upward energy. And James Hillman, wrote marvelously on this topic, that the puer needs to also find the valleys and the low places.
I love James Hillman's work and Joseph Campbell's work. Listeners, all of these are really wonderful authors who are also archetypally Jungian oriented scholars. And so when we're talking about this, Dr. Nick, and you're saying, okay, the puer, and let's imagine this puer who's reaching for the stars, going upward, enjoying not at all having the feet touch the ground. That's what the puer's like. They like to be off on the adventures.
Mhm.
And often when you're working with the puer does not want to come down to rest. They don't understand that there is the possibility, in fact, the necessity of coming to earth
Right.
to rest, to recalibrate, to possibly grow other parts of the personality
Right.
that are not
Right.
all about the self and the self's adventures. Please
Right.
talk about that.
Sure. Yeah. I mean, honestly, if I had one of my clients come to me with this story, and of course, I'm not a therapist. I deal with spirituality. But if a client was coming to me with this and really kind of invoking this Peter Pan image,
Mhm.
I would say, great, let's go into the Peter Pan image. Let's go into the story. And what does Peter Pan do? You know, yes, we see him flying between worlds. We see him doing all these, upward things, but he also has a responsibility. He also has a responsibility in Neverland to the Lost Boys. So there is still that piece, even of Peter Pan, that brings love and caring and nurturing and responsibility for those who need him. And so if we're going to take the Peter Pan image, let's carry the image through. How does this individual who is caught up in the puer, how does this individual understand that they are needed, that their gifts are important, that what they bring to the relationship can nourish their partner? And that's a way to help tie them into this Senex sense of responsibility. Because when they realize, yes, this is all wonderful, but I am also needed in the mundane.
And I very much appreciate that. In fact, it made my heart sort of get activated and tingly because I am such a believer in the power of story, in the power of myth, in the power of fairy tales to teach us. It's why before they were sanitized and romanticized, fairy tales were handed down from generation to generation because they were infused with wisdom from ancestors.
Mhm,
And we then turned them into sort of Disney-ish variations where a lot of the deep meaning was lost. And so when we look at, as you're saying, let's look at the full story of Peter
mhm,
Pan, of how Peter Pan was able to see, oh, yes, it's wonderful up here, but I am also useful and needed down here with these lost boys, these individuals who need me. And I want to also pause with this of how important it is, if we're staying with the story, and we are, that there was no compensation for Peter Pan by coming down and helping others. There was nothing emblazoned in the stars that Peter Pan is the good guy, right?
right,
It became self-gratifying because it filled other parts of the Peter Pan personality, created some balance, and we
right,
often lose that image of that he did come back down. He did do acts of
right.
service
Mhm.
that helped create a fuller personality. And that's what you're saying the puer needs. So for our listeners' question, and the person saying, I'm tired,
Mhm.
how would you invite that listener to, without restraining, because puers do not like restraint. They do not
Right.
like to be told what to do. They do not like to be any sign of control, even if it's not controlling, but any sign of, could you please be more responsible, will feel like a threat to
Mhm.
the Peter Pan. How might one invite?
So I love two things you just said. I'm tired and invite. And those are the two keys here, I think. First of all, of course, your listeners, I'm sure, are very familiar with, nonviolent language. So the individual can come to their partner and say, I am tired. Not I'm tired of you or I'm tired of what you're doing, but I am tired. I am in need of support. I am in need of nurturing. And the invitation becomes something to allow the puer to feel an accomplishment, an ability to be there to support, a feeling of being truly needed. And, sometimes that invitation includes some really specific things. Like, can you please vacuum? Okay. I know in my own relationship, my husband has the most amazing relationship with the physical world. he can drive down the road and tell you why the road was designed incorrectly and how it should have been built in the first place.
Mhm.
And he's just sort of a natural engineer. That is not me. My stepson once joked, how can people trust you with the metaphysical when you can't see the milk has gone bad in the fridge? And it's sort of a running joke in the family. Sometimes my husband has to just be really direct and say, you know, this needs to be done. Because guess what? Nick, you're up in the clouds somewhere and you're not paying attention to some of these mundane needs. And so sometimes it is just that really direct, specific invitation. The puer, we want our partners to read our minds. We want our partners to see everything we see and see it the way we see it. But the puer is up in the sky. The puer is in the heavens, flying between worlds. The puer doesn't sometimes even see that these things in the valleys are also needing attention. And so we can invite, but it is in that sense, like you said, of I'm tired. This is my experience. Can you help me? As
Uh,
opposed to you're wrong and you're not doing this right.
Dr. Nick, you just got to what I was going to invite you to explain. So, for our listeners who might be unfamiliar or might need a refresher with nonviolent communication, what we're talking about here is how, for many of us, we were raised with the word should as a leading word. You should do this, you should do that. No, you're wrong, that sort of thing. All of that we have come to find is actually very violent, and it's called violent communication. In fact, the word should has been called by some very high level experts one of the most violent words in our language. Why? Because this kind of terminology, that kind of verbiage can feel very shaming and can cause another person's defenses to really come up. So if we learn to be gentler on ourselves and others and use things as Dr. Nick was saying, and I'll ask you in a moment just to go into more of it, of what are called I messages. Because if we say I feel, I perceive, I feel hurt, I feel sad, I perceive that this situation is, getting really, anxious for me, that sort of thing. We tend to not trigger somebody else's defenses, and then the communication tends to be a lot smoother. So, Dr. Nick, please say more about why nonviolent communication, especially for this listener who's very frustrated. Very frustrated, and it sounds like they're at a breaking point
Mhm,
almost.
mhm.
So we want to help them understand how they might be able to communicate with their significant other to get good results. Not that we can always get the best results no matter how nonviolent our communication is,
Sure.
depending on where somebody is on the, emotionally, psychologically, emotionally, mentally, which are they cannot absorb even the kindest remarks in a good way. So please explain.
Sure. So as you said, I language is couched in the experience of the speaker. And so it's, when this happens, this is how I feel. Not when you do this, you make me to feel this way. Uh, you know, couple of just simple examples. My husband, as I said, has this wonderful connection with the world around us. He used, the toothbrush charger is on my side of the bathroom, and we just use one. And he puts his toothbrush on the charger when it needs it, and he sets mine to the side. Well, when we were first married, he would do that, and he would leave my toothbrush sat off to the side when he was done using the charger. And it's a little thing, but it really bugged me. I sort of have, I sort of have this issue of people moving my things. Um, and you can interpret that however you like for a diagnosis. But, I came to him and said, when you leave my toothbrush off to the side, I feel disrespected. I feel as if I wasn't worth putting my things back. And I made it about me and what I'm experiencing, not what he did. Not saying you did wrong. This is how I feel. And I know this wasn't your intent. And you know what? He started doing that. Another story, because, as I said, I came out late in life. I was married for 18 years to a woman and raised children. And the breakdown of the marriage was very contentious, very
Oh, I'm
frustrating
sorry.
for a while. And it was several years later, after some of my own growth and unlearning some really bad habits, I was able to come and have a conversation with her that was, I realize I contributed this to our marriage being what it was. I've learned that I made these mistakes. I wish I'd understood myself better 20 years ago. I said absolutely nothing about any frustrations I had toward her. It was, I'm owning my part. And, from past experience, I didn't expect that to necessarily even land. But I felt good closure needed me to do that.
Mhm.
And, it took just a few hours, but she reached out to me and essentially did the same thing.
Oh my
And
goodness.
and that experience made such a shift in our conversations and interactions since then. And it becomes, it's so healing. But it was a matter of me owning my part and reaching out and saying, I'm sorry that I brought this to the table. And thank you for what you contributed to my life. And of course, we're not talking about that here, that kind of breakup here, but it's an example of the kind of language. And it's sort of magical, quite honestly. When we come with our open heart, realizing, I know this isn't your intention, but this is how I feel when this happens.
Dr. Nick, I think both examples are so beautiful, and we are aligned in so many ways. And I'm thinking about in my book, The Joy of Imperfect Love, how I talk about every action that we take is generally either positive, a reach toward, or a push away. Pushing somebody away from us. So a reach toward or a push away, and that's our choice. Very few of our actions on this planet, in and out of relationships, are neutral.
Right.
Very few. And you're talking about whether the beautiful example with your former wife, where you reached out and apologized. You did a sincere, heartfelt I message apology. And that's it, and it stimulated something in her. And we can never say how another person's going to respond. We can only take control, have power over how we act. And then the gorgeous example of the toothbrush with your husband, because we all have those things. It
Sure.
doesn't make us diagnosable. It just means we have our preferences in life. And I love, absolutely love how you brought it down to the basic of respect.
Mhm.
And that in my clinical work, in my personal life, I think that many of us get triggered by the thing, but it's not the thing. It's not the toothbrush. It's not the spoiled milk. It's not the car left without gas. It's not that we vacuumed and they didn't.
Mhm.
It's the fact that we don't feel respected.
Right.
And so when we use healthy communication tools, basic is iMessages, mirroring. And mirroring listeners is simply when each partner speaks their truth. We do it one at a time, and the other partner shows they're really listening by non-judgmentally mirroring it back, reflecting it back. So didn't want to go without explaining that term. So we can see how when you say to your husband or said, "Hey, I know you didn't mean it, but I felt disrespected," when you did this. So the other partner doesn't feel blamed or judged. It's just like, oh, well, I can do a reach toward my husband and put his toothbrush, put their toothbrush back where it belongs,
Mhm.
back in the container or wherever they would prefer it to be. And so I think that's a wonderful example, looping back to the listeners, concern, their
Mhm.
question. Although these might sound like very simple steps, as you said, Dr. Nick, they're magical. When
Mhm.
we get into some of these habits, and as we learn them, listeners, it's a long road. Things don't change overnight. We just want to become more and more aware of how many reach towards we're doing
Mhm.
and how many pushaways, and not trying to change a partner's core values, but we can certainly invite them to engage in behaviors that don't feel like pushaways to us. What do you think, Dr. Nick?
I think you're exactly right. I think one more thing, again, if we take the story further, look at Peter and Wendy.
Hmm.
You know, Peter wants Wendy to be a mother. And that's almost the dynamic of this of the reader of the listener question we have here. Peter wants somebody who's going to take care of him and take responsibility. And there's some pushback. Wendy kind of realizes that and says, hold on now. That's not who I am. But at the same time, why was Wendy even pulled into Peter's orbit? Because she needed some of that magic.
Mhm.
So this is all a mutual adventure. And if we are seeing if we are going to be all about the responsibility and we're frustrated with this puer, part of that is that we're neglecting the puer in ourselves. Part of that is we've pushed the puer in ourselves into the shadow, and it's frustrating us to see it reflected outward. And so we can also ask ourselves, where can I join with the puer? Yes, the dishes still have to be washed. The mundane still needs to be taken care of. But also, where can we join in with the puer so that we feel part of that magic and that adventure instead of having to be the opposite to it?
Dr. Nick, as you're speaking, I'm getting that image of Wendy perched near the windowsill or on the windowsill, longingly
Mhm.
looking toward the stars, the sky, and saying, oh, right. And we get her yearning because she is down, planted on the earth, and that is where we go back to the balance. Of course, we all want to be in the stars, and when we work to create balance, we can fly up there and then come back and have our partners fly up with us and create this beautiful dance where sure maybe one of us spends more time in the stars and the other one spends more time, on land, but creating enough balance and unity and harmony where we all get a little bit of glimpse and play in the stars. And it's good for us. It's good for the soul to learn to leave the lockdown of being grounded, of being that person who does it all, and go
Yeah.
play. Go
Yeah.
go fly up in the stars. And I know my husband is very, very good at playing, and he's also good at working, but he's far better at playing than I am. And I love that capacity of his to play because it draws me.
Mhm.
It draws me up into the stars as well. And I think when we look at this listener and how they're just seeking that balance. I love how you concretized it to say, invite, invite the puer in your life to share some of the responsibilities. And then maybe you can both spend some more time dancing in the stars.
Yes, absolutely. Beautifully put.
Dr. Nick, is there I want to have you back. I want to talk fairy tales with you and more. I'm such a fan. So could you tell is there anything else you'd like to, highlight on this particular topic? I know I've taken you here and there.
No, I think it's a wonderful topic. It's a wonderful conversation to have. And for me, of course, it comes back to spirituality and to realize too that our spirituality needs both the senex and the puer. That
Mhm.
we need some structure and we need play. We need to be able to reach for the stars as well as valleys. And that is the dance. That is what's life-giving. We cannot be just the senex. Being just the senex is every bit as harmful and dangerous as being all the puer. Those two
Absolutely.
need to be brought together and nourish each other.
And that's, where we get concepts like yin and yang,
Mhm.
light and shadow, peaks and valleys. If we didn't have the valleys, we would never know what a peak is.
Right.
If we only had peaks, we wouldn't have the juxtaposition of the valley to know how far we've come and the delights of what we can see up above contrasted with
Mhm.
the beauty of the valley down below. We wouldn't have the Grand Canyon, for heaven's sakes, right?
Right.
Without the majesty of that, without the valleys. It's not possible. So thank you for blessing us with your delightful presence. It's just so yummy. I am so appreciative. Can you tell our listeners where they can find you?
Absolutely. The easiest place is dancingancestors.com. That's where I center my spiritual guidance work as well as my other writings and such. And listeners can certainly reach out to me there. I am also on Facebook as Dr. Nick Literski. But again, the website is probably the easiest way to reach out to me and learn a little bit more about what I do.
And listeners, there's a lot to learn about when you see the papers that they have written, the beautiful just wealth of experience and knowledge that Dr. Nick has to offer. It's just beautiful. So listeners, I'm going to spell Dr. Nick's name, Dr. Nick Literski, Literski, and you can find him at dancingancestorsPlural.com. That's dancingancestorsPlural.com. So thank you for being with us today, Dr. Nick. It has been a privilege, a joy, and a delight. And my thanks to our listeners for sharing this wonderful journey into the stars and the valleys with us today. And this is Imperfect Love.
Thanks so much for sharing your time with me today. Remember, you have the power to transform your life and love fearlessly, if imperfectly, and it's my privilege to help you along the way. You can find more life-changing content, including my books and other podcast episodes, at drcarlamanly.com. Feel free to submit your own confidential questions through my website. I'll do my very best to include your issue on a future episode. If you found this podcast helpful, please subscribe and leave a review. Until we connect again, this is Dr. Carla Marie Manly wishing you oceans of blessings and love. Please note, this podcast is psychoeducational in nature and is not intended to replace formal mental health support. Please contact your healthcare provider or emergency hotline if you need psychiatric care. And as always, please take good care of your amazing, wonderful self.